That's good.
This copy. It was nice. It's one of the best snaps ever.
I think that's. I went home and took my second shower today. Okay. All right. We are going to continue our conversation about evolution today. We had talked about genetic drift and gene flow, and we'll review them here in a second, and then we were ready to talk about natural selection. Definitely where I want us to go after we talk about natural selection is to consider some of these different pathways that selection operates in and some of the caveats that go along with evolution. You may be in a point where you have gone through all these kind of misunderstandings or common misconceptions about evolution, but sometimes it's helpful to remember these little specific details so that we understand better the evolutionary processes involved. From that, I want us then to talk about what adaptations really are, and this interesting area where we get into not only adaptive radiation and we get lots of new species that burst out onto the scene, but then also extinction and what it looks like when you have an organism that is just one genotype that looks like it's adapting, but actually it's just acclimation or phenotype plasticity. The different possibilities from one genotype that are available from a range of environmental conditions that that organism is growing in or maturing in. And that plasticity, acclimation versus adaptation lets us talk about some other terms that often come up in evolution and ecology in terms of clines and ecotypes and genetic differentiation. What is this gray zone that happens in between species? Which is definitely where we were talking in actually my environmental studies class last time. We have a species definition, but it only works for certain types of organisms. And we have lots of organisms that seem to break the species barrier rather frequently. And how do we deal with that? What does it look like? What does it mean for community dynamics? Chapter 5 of our textbook starts off with this lovely little picture of these beetles that come up to the top of the sand dunes in the deserts in Africa in the early morning, and the dew condenses on their bodies, and then they have these little grooves on their shells that channel that dew right up to their mouths. And in this way, they're able to drink and get moisture every day from this really nice fit between the form of their body and the functionality that they need. And so it's this example of the end product, or the current product, I should say, of natural selection in this environment. Those beetles that were better able, both behavior and body morphology-wise, to collect dew and drink it, of course, survived and came to dominate the population in terms of genetics. Okay, so we had left off class last Thursday talking about these 3 different processes of evolution. See if you can turn to your neighbor and define genetic drift and gene flow. What were these 2 processes that we are going to contrast to natural selection today? What does genetic drift mean, and what is gene flow?
Genetic drift is like a chance event.
I don't know, honestly. Hard.
Being like, I didn't know that's a good place to be.
Not a natural selection, that's it. Not gonna lie. I can't think today, apparently. I mean, it's been all my focus on.
I know the answers, like I wrote in my notes, but
Yeah, but
I can't say from my mind.
yeah, from the top of my head, can't place it.
Just know where they are on your notes. When it comes to learning,
The drift is
Away.
the part from each
Yeah.
other.
You got it.
Natural selection
Yeah.
is selection of natural things.
Yes. It sounds so right.
Okay, what is genetic drift?
The drift of like what would be similar organisms kind of drifting and developing some differences in between themselves. Like they're kind of drifting apart, but not necessarily.
Why? I would say
Due to
like
random chance.
random chance is the key. You have random changes in the genetics of a population over time. And again, we're talking about something that outside of the species and its interactions with its environment causes a change in population genetics. You have the random death of certain individuals that remove certain alleles, or you have certain individuals that randomly get to mate more often and produce more offspring. And so they become a greater portion of the population in the next generation. But it doesn't have anything to do with fit to their environment or with adaptation. It's a random who wins, essentially. What about gene flow?
So merging of alleles from two different or more populations.
Yeah, here you've got two different populations, and we're going to have genes or alleles that are moving between them. Okay, that's gene flow. And we have alleles that are moving between populations. And again, you can think of adult organisms moving around with their gene content with them. We think of this within species lots of times, in that you have males that disperse from their home family group and take their genes to mix with other prides or harems or groups of individuals. And that's gene flow. That's taking alleles and moving them. In the case of gene flow, again, it's random who does the migrating. Okay, it's not because this organism is more adapted to this environment. It's just because that's where they flew to or landed or ended up. Okay, or where the wind or the water or the waves carried them. We had that example of the birds on the island that they had in the middle of the island. You had this migration from the mainland that actually made the middle island bird population less adapted to their environment because of this gene flow. It was the opposite effect of what we think of in terms of natural selection and adaptation. Was the actual result from gene flow. It was like bad for the population survival. Everybody, you feel good? The key to both is that it's random, okay? And that's going to be different from what we talk about in natural selection. The source of variation for any of these processes is always random mutation of DNA or recombination of DNA during sexual reproduction, but it's only in natural selection that we see an adaptive process that's going to produce individuals that are better fit for their environment.
Can gene flow not like help natural selection in a way?
It can. And so in some cases, when we talk about preserving genetic diversity, we often want to improve gene flow so that we have a greater variety of alleles in a population for natural selection to be able to work with or work on or work in conjunction with.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's a great point to recognize, is that these processes are all working at the same time within any given population. Okay, cool. All right. So natural selection, we have differential survival and reproduction is the little 3-word tagline that you can think of for natural selection. And we're going to see that different organisms, based upon their differing genetics, are going to survive and reproduce to different extents. And that's usually linked. The longer you survive, the more offspring you reproduce. But not always. Sometimes you can have a very short yet productive life cycle that does better than a longer-lived, slower reproducing organism. And usually in natural selection, we're talking about and measuring the fitness of different individuals. And we define fitness then as an individual's proportional contribution to the next generation. How many of the next generation have their allele content or some of their alleles? And so you're more fit if more of your alleles make it to the next generation. And based upon these definitions, you can start to see where these selfish gene hypotheses start to appear in evolutionary biology and in our discussions about natural selection. That whatever makes your gene reproduce more and leave more of it in the next generation makes you more fit. There are caveats because there are random influences. Gene flow, genetic drift can make you less fit. And there are lots of different selective pressures. It's not always about number of offspring, as it is about getting more of your offspring to survive to adulthood, to reproduce themselves. Sometimes it's not about making a number of offspring that's greater. It's about surviving to reproduce to begin with. So there can be different places where natural selection can interact with fitness. Okay. But in general, if more of your offspring survive to adulthood, you're going to be more fit because more of your genes are carried to the next generation. All right, cool. There are 3 kind of steps or things that have to happen for natural selection to take place. And if any one of these is missing or broken, then natural selection will not be active within a given population or species. Okay. And the first thing is that there have to be variations in the population. If everybody is genetically the same at all your loci, or if at any given place in your genome everybody has the same gene, then there will be no natural selection taking place. There will be no evolution at that marker until mutation happens, okay, until you get variations. So in our little example here, we've got green beetles and we have brown beetles. Okay. The second thing that has to be true is that those variations have to be linked to differential survival and reproduction. And along with this is the understanding behind it, the assumption that there are going to be more offspring produced than can survive. Okay, that there are not enough resources in the environment for everybody to survive. Otherwise they would. And again, natural selection wouldn't take place. But those organisms that are best fit are going to survive and reproduce more. And that fitness is based and tied to the variations in their genetics. And so in our example, we have these brown beetles and these green beetles, and we have this bird that prefers to eat green beetles. Okay, and so brown beetles are going to survive longer and reproduce more. That variation in color of the beetle is linked to their survival and reproductive success, their fitness. If the bird were instead picking beetles based on size, of body size, or antennae morphology, color wouldn't matter, and color wouldn't be something that evolution and natural selection were working on in this particular instance. Okay, and the third thing that has to be true is that those variations that are displayed by the organism have to be heritable. They have to actually be tied to differences at the DNA level that can be passed on from parent to offspring. They can't just be random variations that are in somatic cells. They have to happen and be present in the gamete-producing cell lines. And thus, those organisms that survive and reproduce more will have more of their genes present in the next generation. And we'll see a shift in population genetics over time for evolution. In this case, more brown beetles survive, and so more brown beetles are produced. Variations exist. Variations are tied to differential reproduction and survival. They're tied to fitness, and those variations are heritable. What is likely to happen in this brown beetle population now in its interaction with birds?
It's going to do good with the green beetles. Aren't going to do so good.
Yeah, and if you wipe out all the green beetles, what is likely to happen to the brown beetles? And again, like thinking about this bird predator.
Well, they have less competition too for food.
Right, and so again, and it becomes this cycle of kind of perpetuating itself that there are more brown beetles, so they're going to get more access to resources, so they'll do better, so there'll be more brown beetles. And that's the idea. That's the winning evolution, is that if you get a big enough proportion of the population, you're going to be the best competitor on an allelic scale, and you'll keep going as the dominant portion. Is the bird likely just to fly away and not eat beetles? Then what's the bird going to do?
Eating beetles.
Yeah, it's going to start eating brown beetles.
Brown beetles
because that's
start
what's there.
developing more specialized traits.
Right, exactly. And then you're going to get another round of evolution, and that's based on escaping predation. Okay, and it's constant. It's continuous. What we see in organisms today is the current endpoint, is the current place where they are in evolution. That's going to change over time because evolutionary pressures keep acting on populations. Okay, both the bird population is going to adapt to there only being brown beetles, and the brown beetle population now has to adapt to being predated upon by birds.
So the 3 things are reproduction, heredity, and variation in fitness.
Yeah, you have to have variation in the population. There has to be reproductive, differentiation, and reproductive survival and fitness. And those variations have to be heritable. And again, that reproductive differentiation and survival and fitness has to be linked to those variations. Okay. If the selection for reproductive survival and number isn't what's varying in your population, then that's not what's going to be worked on. If size doesn't matter, and that's where your individuals in your population vary on size, then you'll keep having a variety of sizes. You won't see a change over time. But if there's differences in color, and color matters, and you get to mate and reproduce, then you will see a change based on color. Okay. All right. Within natural selection, then we can talk about adaptations. And adaptations are these heritable traits that maintain or increase fitness for a given set of environmental conditions. So an adaptation is something that makes you more fit for your environment. And adaptations in this light of natural selection are always positives. They always benefit a species. They maintain or increase fitness. That's an adaptation. What we see in these adaptations is that different genotypes will express this same trait to different levels or different amounts, or they'll display different types of this trait or phenotype depending on their genotype. So again, the variation is tied to their heritable genes. That makes it an adaptation. If it's something that happens in just your own cell line, that your body becomes more adapted to high intense UV rays, but you aren't able passing that on to your children, it's not an adaptation. It's an acclimation. If you're able to pass that trait on, that makes you more fit, it's an adaptation. Okay. It has to affect the long-term reproductive success of the organisms, and recognize that an adaptation can be affected by organisms interacting with each other, same species, organisms from two different species in the case of symbiosis or parasitism or predation, even some types of competition interacting with each other, and the environment, of course, can play a role in adaptation. That if temperature changes, pH changes, moisture levels change, that can be something that selects upon the different varieties of the gene to make one more fit for that environment. Okay. In our example that we have here, we're looking at some finches on the Galapagos Islands, and we're looking at the numbers of finches that there were. And this was work done by Peter and Rosemary Grant, one of the ecologists that you guys did for the first homework assignment. And they were out there looking at the number of finches, from 1975 till today, actually, but this is one of their first experiments. And they saw that in 1976, there was this huge drought on this particular island, and the number of finches just plummeted. A whole bunch of them died because there was not any food because the plants died. What they found in this same time period, though, is that there was differential survival and hence reproduction of these surviving finches based upon their beak depth, how big their beak was. And that those finches that had a bigger beak did better during this drought conditions because they were able to crack open and get at the few remaining big, heavy, drought-resistant seeds that were in abundance at the end of this drought time period. If you look at the population genetics then of these surviving finches, there's an overabundance of these big, thick, heavy-billed finches versus the guys with the smaller bills. If they shift in population genetics in just a couple year time period due to changing environmental conditions.
So, what did you say it wasn't inheritable? You said it was called
an acclimation.
Acclimation
instead of an adaptation. Okay. And I'm like, can we pick a word that starts with a different letter?
Yeah. Okay.
So at least we could remember the difference more easily. And we were like, no.
Yeah. What about plasticity? So like I've heard that in some of the articles that I'm reading about animal or plasticity.
Yeah. So phenotype plasticity kind of overlaps with this idea of acclimation. And in phenotype plasticity, you have one genotype And the expression of different alleles or proteins to different extents is going to be set by the conditions that organism grows in or finds itself in. And so in some instances, you may get a red moth, and in some instances, you may get a black moth from the same genotype, depending upon what it was exposed to in terms of its environment as a baby. Okay. Happens a lot of times in plants, again, that you see, you have the same plant, and it will grow all big and spindly if it's in low light conditions, and it will grow straight up and tall if it's in high light conditions. That's plasticity. That's the range of expression and possibilities given one genotype. But it's not going to be heritable. The offspring are going to grow spindly or tall depending upon what conditions they grow in. It's not set by the conditions the parent was in, what gets passed on to offspring. And again, we tend to talk about that as adaptation to the local environment, but it's better thought of as acclimation to the current conditions based on phenotype plasticity from one genotype. You're not seeing tall and spindly plants because you have different genes in those different organisms. It's one genotype given different environmental conditions. It can only pass on one thing to its offspring, regardless of how it grows as an adult. When we get to those slides, okay, cool. All right. So some things to remember about natural selection. It is the only process that over time increases the match between organisms and their environment, that because drought and hard seeds were present, we saw more finches with heavier, thicker bills. That's natural selection. Gene flow and genetic drift can produce fits and matches between organisms and environments, but it's random, okay? It's not selected for, it's not adaptive. It was total chance. Natural selection kind of gives us genetic differentiation then between organisms within a species and between different species. That you will get different organisms over time as conditions change. And that within a given species, as conditions change, as interactions between organisms change, you'll get new adaptations, and different traits will become adaptive or maladaptive over time. At the same time that we're getting genetic differentiation and we're getting adaptations and we're getting variations in populations, remember that species remain similar to each other because they share an ancestor and they have a set base of DNA that they can work with. And so even though all these three different birds are adapted for their own particular situation, and we recognize them as different species that are genetically differentiated from each other, because they all shared an ancestor of the same kind of family of birds, they all look very similar to each other. Okay. And even though in natural selection we see these fits between organisms and the processes and functions and environments in which they find themselves, in this case again it's like beaks and feet and feather adaptations for getting access to different food resources in these birds, the source of that mutation was random. Okay, it wasn't that the birds set out and were like, oh, there's this new food source in cactus flower fruits. We need to become better adapted to eat that food source. Randomly in their population, they got an adaptation that let them start eating cactus fruits. And so those organisms that went off and did that became their own species and population. Okay, there wasn't a conscious decision to go after that food source. If that mutation had never happened, they would have never started eating cactus fruits. And again, when we talk about natural selection and evolution and adaptation, we so often use language that indicates that there was some purpose. Like, so obviously, this organism is so perfectly fit to living in this ecosystem that it was meant to be here. Okay. Well, yeah, now it is. Okay. 20 generations ago, it didn't live here at all. Okay. And it was random that these mutations arose that let it start to live in this ecosystem.
What does the new SP mean? Like specialty
Oh,
or
species.
species?
That's okay.
So if there's like no need to evolve, like there's unlimited resources, does natural selection like really take place?
It won't happen in that arena of gaining access to resources. And instead you might get selection based on mates.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just have all of those minutes of the
Oh, okay.
canvas you want.
Sure.
That was good enough.
Sure, I'll put it in the classroom. In case you weren't aware, this is kind of next week is the big kind of student walkout Fridays for Change here in the United States. And so on Friday at noon, none of us can go. Downtown is the big student walkout for Cincinnati. And so one of my environmental studies students put up some flyers for that. But I think next Wednesday is the big kind of national meeting about it. And I think there's another set of walkouts and kind of student strikes next Friday, but I don't know if we're having one here in Cincinnati versus at the beginning of the time. Care about stuff like that. I've never had a student that was like so excited about it. I'm like, sure, I can give you some flyers. If you're going to be excited about it, I can add fuel to the fire. My aspect on it is that I do believe in climate change science, but I'm more enthused that you guys take an interest in what side of this debate you're on, and that you have some reason supported with evidence for your position, one side or another, and that it's your world, and so like it's time to take some ownership and responsibility for it, because my generation isn't. Doesn't look like we're gonna. Okay, all right. So one thing that's interesting in species is that why aren't species perfect? Why does variation continue to persist? Why isn't it that in every population, one set of alleles has become fixed as like the best for that particular situation? Why do we still have a whole bunch of different alleles in a given population? And one is that they're randomly being reproduced, like they're still constantly being made. Another reason variation persists is because it may not be that there's any selective force at that particular allele, and so there's no pressure to move towards one allele or another. And the other thing that seems to crop up time and time again in organisms is this idea of balancing selection, that we need to preserve some diversity, and that these maladaptive traits sometimes are held on to because they offer some advantage in another arena. That they may seem really bad for organism growth or reproduction or survival, but actually they help. And they may not help all the time, but they may help in the heterozygote situation. And this is a case of sickle cell anemia, where we see that there's a real heterozygote advantage, that the heterozygote has the dominant and the recessive allele, of course, and so you don't get the full-blown problems of having two copies of the recessive. The dominant can hide the major deleterious effects of that allele, but there is some advantage to being a heterozygote. You don't have any problems, but you get any advantage that recessive might offer you. And in this case, we tend to stabilize variation. There is actually a pressure to keep you from being perfect, to keep that bad thing from being completely lost from the population. And so in sickle cell anemia, you can be normal, homozygote, dominant, you have normal red blood cells, all your red blood cells are fine. If you have sickle cell anemia, you have two copies of the recessive allele. That means that your hemoglobin in your red blood cells does not form its complex correctly, and you can't carry oxygen as well. And it actually causes the structure of your red blood cells to get sickle shaped rather than these nice little red balloons. They look like that thing on the old flag for USSR. Yeah, they get wiggly and they get real sickle shaped. And when that happens, not only not carry oxygen well enough, so you're prone to things like strokes and fainting spells, get really bad cramps when you work out. Sometimes you like overextend yourself, you can't get enough oxygen. It also means that your red blood cells will stick together because they have that malformed shape, and you can get blood clots, and that's when you die. And so that's a real problem if you have both. And so that's selected against. But the heterozygotes have an advantage in sickle cell anemia, that those malformed red blood cells are not as susceptible to infection by the malaria parasite. So if you're a heterozygote, you don't have any problems with your red blood cells, and you're partially protected from getting malaria, which is an extra good thing if you happen to live in a malaria prone zone, aka most of the subtropics, most of the world's population. And so we see that the number of heterozygotes for sickle cell anemia goes way up in malaria prone populations, and that there's an advantage to being a heterozygote. It's bad if you get both, but it maintains itself because it does actually offer some fitness. It's pretty cool. One of the first studies in human evolution and evolution taking place in a short time period was actually done in the different alleles for sickle cell anemia in populations of Europeans and sub-Saharan Africans.
Is there like a possibility that you can have two dominant, I guess, thriving populations that are thriving off natural selection, but like one that's not, like they kind of just did like a branching effect where there are two ways that it went? Like,
Oh, yeah.
obviously not just like,
Yes, yeah,
well, even multiple.
yeah, and we call that,
kind of like how humans are, like how we have all different skin color, all different.
oh
hair.
yeah, yeah, and definitely we'll see it in our slides. So we're going to talk about these 3 different ways that natural selection can break a population. You can get stuck in the middle, you can get stuck on both sides, you can get stuck on one side. Okay, I want to give you one other example of balancing selection, again, where variation persists. And that's in situations we call frequency dependent selection. And it's kind of like our brown and our green beetles, where like, first it's bad to be green because you get picked on, but then it's bad to be brown because you're the only thing that's left and the green has a chance to crop back up, or orange pops in, whatever. In this case, we have fish, these parasitic fish, which are the gray ones. And these parasitic fish come up to their prey fish, and they're either left-mouthed or right-mouthed. They approach from one side of the prey fish or another. And so what happens in this population is that if you have a bunch of left-mouthed individuals, the prey fish learn to always look to this side to avoid the left-mouthed predatory fish. Okay, they're always like, oh my God, I might get snuck up on from this side. Which means that when that situation happens, the right-mouthed fish now have an advantage. They can sneak up on more prey fish because the prey fish are always looking on this side and they're not looking over their other shoulder. So if you start out with lots of left-mouthed guys, that actually gives an advantage to the right-mouthed ones. And the right-mouthed ones then will increase in abundance. But once the right-mouthed ones get abundant enough, all the fish start looking over this shoulder, and the right-mouthed guys have a problem, and the left-mouthed guys are like, yeah, okay, now we can sneak up. And so the population flip-flops between left and right-mouthed dominated fish, depending upon whoever was just most abundant, okay? It's frequency-dependent selection. Who is most abundant actually gets selected against. And it preserves that remnant population of diversity because they have an advantage actually over who's dominant in terms of population. That's kind of cool. And again, it's this idea that being the dominant portion of the population means that you get access to the most resources, but it also means you're the most obvious to predators. And so that can actually be to a disadvantage for you to be abundant in a population. And it causes variation to persist over the long term, and it causes populations to ping pong sometimes between these different allelic states. And these fish eat scales. They run up to their prey fish and they like take a mouthful of scales and a little bit of flesh, and that's what they eat. Isn't that nice? Yeah. So that's what they do, and that's just it. So the prey fish isn't actually killed in any one of these events, and that's how they get to always be looking at one side for this particular, mouthed fish to approach them with their little sucker mouths.
So they don't die when they get bit. They're just like, ow, like.
Yeah, they're like, dang it. And then they want to constantly be protecting that side because that's where they get the most attacks from. And then the other fish have an advantage because they can sneak in and get more food.
The poor fish, the poor prey fish.
Yeah, the poor prey fish. It's not one side, it's the other.
He's just getting
He's just getting
picked on.
It's just always getting picked on, yeah. Okay. All right. So again, variation persists because sometimes being less abundant actually is better in terms of survival and reproduction. Not only can there be an advantage to having both alleles and variation persisting, but sometimes being less abundant actually becomes advantageous. Okay. So again, why aren't species perfect? One thing to remember is that selection can only act on existing variations. If there's not a mutation or that's not possible in the genetics of that species, then that will never arise. You know, like it would be awesome if humans had chlorophyll in our skin and we could make our own food, but we don't have the genes for that. We are very unlikely to ever do so on our own. We will never be that perfectly adapted to our environment because our genetic ancestry doesn't include that possibility. Again, we can envision species that it would be perfect if they had this change in form or function possibility. But if there's no mutation for that, if there's no possibility of that gene creeping in from their ancestry, we're never going to see that perfect fit between an organism and its environment. Okay. And that's this next part. Evolution is limited by history. And that there's lots of variation that's possible, but it's also constrained, again, to the DNA and the genetic content that that species has. You can only work with the DNA that you've got, unless you're a bacteria and you grab stuff randomly from your environment. But again, different organisms have different abilities for taking in and taking up new genetic content, for mixing and matching genes that exist within their population. Jellyfish are never going to have gills because it's not in their genes to do so. Humans will never be blue-skinned because we don't have the genes for that. I keep saying yet because we're finding new tools that seem like we can start to do these things. Okay, my next thing to remember is that adaptations are often compromises, and that what may be good for you in terms of finding a mate is bad for you when it comes to predation. What helps you escape predation makes you worse at finding a mate or competing for resources. And we're going to see that over and over again as we talk throughout the semester about different organisms and adaptations as we get into it with autotrophs and heterotrophs in the next few lectures, is that it's this balance between what's possible and what actually makes you more fit and survive to reproduce more. And so again, what can be good for one part of your life might be bad for you overall as an organism. And that's definitely the case that we see lots of times in mating plumage in birds, is that males go to great lengths and they spend a lot of resources attracting mates, but that means that they can't fly as far, they can't actually get as many resources over the course of their life, and they might have much shorter life expectancy than females because there's a cost to putting out that mating plumage. And so again, it's a balance and a trade-off. If you want to live longer, maybe you don't have such a great display, but if you don't have such a great display, you aren't going to pass on your genes anyways. And so for some organism, it's this trade-off of let's go hard and fast versus let's try to stick it out and go slow and steady for a long time. Okay, the last thing to remember is that these factors are all interacting. Chance, natural selection, and the environment are interacting in an iterative process, like with that frequency dependent selection. What's good at one time may not be good another season, and that the environment that you find yourself in can make something adaptive or maladaptive. At the same time, natural selection is picking and choosing among the best alleles. We have gene flow and genetic drift that are randomly affecting the population at the same time. This leads to fun things like chaos theory, and that it's just entirely random and that you can't make these types of predictions about what will be most fit in the future. And it leads to a more full understanding that, again, evolution is a random process that happens continuously to organisms, and that what may be adaptive today might not be helpful in the future. And your appendix is a great example of that. We have an appendix at some point in our history. Evolutionarily, we needed an appendix, but today we don't use it. Okay, and so again, we're in the process of losing our appendix over time, but we had it in the first place because it helped us at one point somehow. Probably digestive.
This is kind of random, but there actually was a family, I think, in Kentucky who like had blue skin.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think they had like some kind of disease that like messed with their blood,
Oh,
That's,
cool.
Because
They're like-
didn't they like breed in their community?
Yeah,
That's
there's
like,
like
Yeah,
breeding.
that's another thing. And so that's where gene flow starts to be important sometimes. And we talk about, so again, in conservation biology, we touched on this a little bit last Thursday, this idea of minimum viable population size, and that when you lose genetic diversity due to chance or gene flow or natural selection, sometimes you can evolve yourself into a corner that's maladaptive, actually, for your current environment or conditions. And that one way to recover a population is to increase gene flow, to bring in allelic variance. And, the reason why we have these social norms about breeding with your cousins and marrying your brothers and sisters is because we recognize that two close parents in humans often brings those deleterious alleles to the forefront, that you can't actually hide under the heterozygotes.
That's so hard.
That's right.
Yeah.
Cool, but weird.
Blue.
I would feel
Like a Smurf.
he does look
He was a Papa Smurf.
Okay, let me see what's on the next slide super quick. Okay, all right. The next thing we're going to talk about are these three modes of selection that can happen, that can move allele frequencies in different directions on our kind of bell curve of consciousness. Okay, so we'll talk about these modes of selection. Variation is random. What's out there in the genes that are produced is random, but selection isn't. And so, snakes have this amazing ability to unhinge their jaws and extend them to swallow things that are bigger than they are in some cases. That's something that's been selected upon time and time again, that those snakes that randomly had unhingeable jaws got more food, and so they passed on more of their genes. And now we see that as a defining characteristic of snakes. Okay. But at some point in the past, they couldn't do that, and it was a random mutation that led to this ability. Okay, so there are three scenarios that we see that often happen when natural selection interacts with the population. And the first one is what we call directional selection. And in directional selection, we have conditions that favor individuals at one extreme or another of the phenotypes and the allelic genotypes that are possible. And so in directional selection, we push the population towards one extreme of the phenotypes that are possible. Everybody gets taller. All the finch bills get bigger and thicker. Okay, and you lose out on one end of the spectrum. You start to lose some alleles. Okay. So directional selection moves the whole population towards one end or another. We see in this case that the relative fitness of one of the phenotypes is much greater than the other ones, the heterozygotes or the homozygotes recessives, we could say in this instance. And that for some reason, the homozygote dominants are favored. And so over time, our population will shift towards more homozygous dominance, more of those dominant alleles in the population. This happened in the Galapagos finches that we talked about a few slides ago, where we got more of those big, thick, heavy-billed finches over time because they had an advantage and we lost all the little thin guys. It happens when we have antibiotic resistance too, and that is if you have the gene for antibiotic resistance, you increase in abundance in the population. If you don't have it, you're gone. We shift the genetics of the whole population towards one end of the possibilities. That's directional selection. Can you give another example? In the case of like the blue skinned humans, it would be like we have shifted away from blue skin. Like blue skin is the tail end here that we were like getting rid of and it's random and not selected for. If they had some crazy advantage that was really helpful, we might all move towards being blue skinned. We might move in that direction. I don't know how to do it.
Breed with them.
I know, yeah. I was like, you have to breed with them, or we'd have to expose ourselves to get the same mutation. And I'm not sure I want to do that. And again, it has to be heritable to be selected upon. It can't just be something that happens in your skin cells. It has to actually be in your gamete producing cells too. Okay. second type of selection is what we call disruptive selection. And this is where, again, you're going to favor the both ends of the extreme rather than just one. And essentially, you're disrupting the range of phenotypes that are possible, and we're taking out the middle ones. There must be an advantage to either end of the spectrum. So this is where conditions favor individuals at both extremes of a phenotype range and not the intermediate. So again, in terms of homozygote recessives, homozygous dominants, and heterozygotes, this would be where the heterozygote is selected against. And that you need to be tiny or you need to be big in order to find some ecological niche. And if you're medium sized, you miss out on both. In this case, again, there's the phenotypes at either end have a higher fitness, and the frequency of the individuals in the population, and it shifts from kind of the normal bell curve to either end of the extreme. In this case, in this example here, which are the black-bellied sea crackers of Cameroon, it's another bird species. And here we find that, again, there are two types of seeds available in the environment for these birds, either very small seeds or big, thick, heavy seeds. And so if you can access either one of those, then you have an advantage. If you've got a medium-sized bill, you can eat on both, but you're not great at getting either. And so you'll be outcompeted by the small or the big-billed birds at either end of the possibilities. And that's disruptive selection, is when you get either extreme and not just one has an advantage. Can you guess what the third type of selection is? The middle, that's right. And that's known as stabilizing selection. When the middle phenotype, when the mix of phenotypes or the heterozygote has an advantage, and everybody then starts to be compressed into that same middle phenotype, that's stabilizing selection. That's like sickle cell anemia, where the heterozygote has some advantage. And over time, then you'd expect the heterozygote to increase in proportion in populations that are exposed to the malaria pathogen. So when conditions favor the intermediate phenotype and the extremes have a disadvantage, then you get stabilizing selection. Shifts the population towards the middle and keeps it there. Sickle cell anemia is an example of that, where the heterozygote has an advantage. The other great example of this is in human birth weights. If you have really small babies, they have lots of complications and problems when they're born. If you have really big babies, it turns out they have almost the exact same problems and complications. It means that there's this middle range of human birth weights where babies are born healthy and they do just fine. If you're at either end of the extreme, then you're selected against. You know, modern medicine has radically changed the outcomes for babies at either end of the extreme, so it's not such a problem. But for a long time, you had to be born in that certain range of birth weights and sizes, or else you were really going to struggle and you'd have much lower survival rate. So again, a common question on an exam might be for me to give you different scenarios and say, you know, show you one of these graphs, the population is shifting to this. Is this stabilizing, directional, disruptive selection? Or I might ask you a short answer question. Tell me the difference between stabilizing, disruptive, and directional selection. Demonstrate to me that you know the difference between these three things.
I don't know what it is, but it's serious.
Feel good? Okay, all right. The next thing I want to talk about are two ways that we make species. And so this genetic differentiation, this variation that happens over time as you push, you know, allelic frequencies to one side or another, can sometimes be enough that we actually get the end result of making new species, that we take one population and we split it, that it branches into two. And so we can think of speciation as a process of forming new species, and it happens, we say, two ways in ecology. It can be either allopatric speciation, which is other country speciation, or sympatric speciation, when it happens all within the same kind of geographic region. And so in allopatric or other country speciation, we're going to have gene flow within a population that's interrupted by some type of geographic or physical barrier. And then because selective conditions are different for those two subpopulations, or because gene flow stops between them, we see that they start to differentiate genetically over time to the point that we recognize them as different species. So it's allopatric speciation when you have a physical or a geographic barrier that results in that break within a population, within one species. And the question then becomes, what would be a geographic barrier that might cause allopatric speciation?
A mountain.
A mountain, excellent. What else?
Water.
Water, okay. In this case, it's like a new dam or a drop in water level that creates an island or some type of, two little ponds instead of one big pond, okay?
Zoo container. Zoo.
Yeah, if we take animals and we confine them and limit who they can breed with, that definitely can act as a speciation event. A road can be a speciation separator for things, like worms and beetles that can't move very far. A space of clear cutting can be something that's a speciating event for certain types of plant species that cannot cross over that type of physical barrier. And that gets really interesting when we start to think about, again, managing biodiversity and thinking about genetic and species diversity is, in some cases, when we interrupt gene flow, we create these subpopulations of organisms then that begin to be affected by local conditions. And because there isn't gene flow, then genetic drift starts to happen and you get speciation between these things that used to be one species, accidentally, by chance, or because of human interactions. And we can do it on purpose, or we can, again, do it by accident. A nice example of allopatric speciation are these little mosquito fish in the Bahamas. And they were once one species, and they lived in one big pool, and then the pool kind of dried out, and you got these two different little ponds. And in one of the pools, there were predatory fish for these little mosquito fish, and in the other pool, there weren't the same predatory fish or birds for these organisms. And so what we found was that in the pool that had predators, they started to develop a different body style, one that was more muscular and stout, so that they would have more muscles to escape their predators, than in the pool that didn't have a predator, which got this kind of slender, more torpedo lozenge-shaped body style. Okay, so we had this predation factor that was starting to act on these two populations. And then it turns out that female mosquito fish prefer to mate with a male that has the same body shape as her sex. And so then you got this sexual selective pressure that caused these two populations to separate from each other. Females that look like this are only going to choose males that look like this, and they're only going to make babies that look like this. Even if we reunited these two populations, they would still stay separated by sexual preference. And so you get two species. You stop that gene flow, you stop that interbreeding to make fertile offspring that defines a species. Fish again, they do weird things. Them and birds. Okay, I mentioned though that there was another way we can make species, and that's by sympatric speciation, and that's sym is same country. And this means that we're going to get two species in the same geographic region, that we're going to have the separation of gene flow and the splitting of populations, not because of a physical barrier. And instead of a physical barrier, we're going to have a new reproductive barrier that blocks the population. And so in the case of our mosquito fish, it started out as a physical barrier. We had these two ponds with different conditions that led to a difference. And that's maintained now by a reproductive barrier, by sympatric speciation. In our case of our fish that we have here, if something happened where we had a new mutant that popped up that created different color fish, even though they were all swimming around together, again, you might find that females preferred a fish that was colored the same as them, and they would start to speciate then and differentiate based upon fish color. That's what's happening again in those chicklid fish in Lake Victoria that I had on the slide that we talked about last Thursday, where their females are choosing based upon what the males look like. And that leads to different species, even though they all live in the same way. Things like sexual selection, habitat differentiation, so that you're no longer in direct competition with each other for resources, and polyploidy when you gain a whole new set of your chromosomes. Those can be reproductive barriers that then lead to speciation over time within the same environment. Does everybody see the two differences here?
So they're in the same pond, but they choose not to mate for other reasons.
Yes, exactly. And again, that can be sexual preference. It can be that you start to live in different areas of the pond. Some of them live in the surface water all the time, so they only see the ones that are in the surface water.
Oh,
Some of them live deep down.
It feels like one were like active during the night and one were active during the
Yes,
day, or
exactly.
temperature differences or something.
Yep. And we see that in lots of organisms that I think there's like a species of skunk that striped skunk and like spotted skunk. And they live in the same wetland habitat, but one is active at night and one is active during the day. And so they become two species because they don't actually interact with each other physically. The same thing can happen if you come into mating season at different times of the year. You're only going to be mating with individuals with the same mating scheme as you, and that can restrict gene flow and cause speciation over time. Okay. The example here, again, is this another fish species. This is the three-spine stickleback. 1, 2, 3 spines, and lives in British Columbia in these little ponds in Canada. They live in the same lake. One of them lives up in the surface waters, and one of them lives down deep in the lake. And never the twigs go into the other portion of the water column. And so they have speciated into two species of fish over time because the benthic ones live down there and they're better adapted to eat and live down there than the ones that live up in the surface water. Okay. Again, sympatric speciation, all those cichlid fish in Lake Victoria. From fossil evidence, we can see they've produced 600 different species of fish in the same lake in just 100,000 years. And that's all sympatric. All right. Let me see what I want to talk about next. I want to talk about this. Okay. The next thing that I want you to think about is that the rate of speciation, the rate at which we make new species, can vary by organism type and kind of over geologic time. Okay, so our rate of speciation can vary. Definitely, the faster an organism reproduces and the more offspring they make, they tend to speciate and they tend to evolve faster. So bacteria evolve really fast to current conditions. Their mutation rate is so much higher, and their ability to grow and divide their single cells into daughter cells is so much faster than a large multicellular organism, which has to grow, reach sexual maturity before it can start to reproduce. Fish and insects, which lay hundreds of thousands to millions of eggs in a given season, are much more capable of evolving and adapting to changing conditions than are elephants or kangaroos or humans, which only produce a few offspring at a time. The more offspring you make, the more chances there are for mutations to arise that will be adaptive for a particular set of conditions. The longer your time span between reproductive events, the slower you're going to evolve. And that's something to consider when we think about climate change, is that fast reproducing species that reproduce very quickly and have quick generation times, are going to adapt to climate change. They're capable of change at the rate at which change is occurring. It's the long-lived organisms, the big trees and plants, and the mammals that reproduce slowly and take a long time to get to sexual maturity that have a lot harder time dealing with climate change because their rate of adaptation is just so much slower than the rate of change for climate. Okay, if we look across geologic time and at the rate at which new species pop up, we recognize that there are kind of two models that we see, and they happen together, and sometimes it looks like it's very obvious that the punctuated equilibrium model has produced the species we see, and other times it's really obvious that it's gradual change over time that produces the species that we have in the fossil record or that we see with us today. In the punctuated equilibrium model, it says that some random mutation happens and you get big changes in a population quickly, And then that's what exists until the next moment of big change, random mutation, and variability that's introduced. You have these long periods of equilibrium punctuated by moments of change and speciation. The punctuated equilibrium model is like you have a mass extinction, all the dinosaurs died, and then boom, you had all this variety that evolved to fill all the niches that were left by the dinosaurs. In a short period of time, you got all these new species after mass extinction. The gradual change model says that you have constant small changes over time that gradually lead to genetic differentiation and speciation. Okay, that's the three-spine stickleback model. That's the finch model in the Galapagos. That over time, one species splits into separate ones. That as gene flow reduces over time between the population, they become separate species. But it's not an instantaneous thing. What we also see in terms of speciation events is that we often see instances of adaptive radiation, and that we have moments of lots of speciation that are often tied to moments of mass extinction, and that the two processes, species extinction and species speciation, the formation of new species, tend to work in tandem. Okay. So here we're looking at the extinction rate. We can see these 5 large mass extinctions that we have noticed from the geological record from fossils. And at the same time that in this time period where we have a mass extinction, the number of families declines pretty drastically. Pretty shortly afterward, the number of families of different types of organisms rebounds. Okay? Just as you have extinction, you will have the formation of new species. They're filling ecological niches. And this is adaptive radiation. What one species was left diversifies and genetically differentiates to become the new species that we see after that extinction event. Definitely, this is when the dinosaurs died out 65.5 million years ago. The asteroid that hit the Earth was probably the final event that nailed the dinosaur coffin closed. But they were on the decline for some period of years, millions of years before then, in terms of numbers and types of organisms. Our other 4 mass extinction events, we know in the Permian one, when we actually had something like 90% of all species on the planet died out in the Permian event. It was triggered by this massive volcanic explosion that happened in several different places on the Earth's crust at the same time. That probably led to then the physical wipeout of whole biomes on terrestrial Earth, and then acidified the oceans, changed sea level, and changed temperature of the world's oceans at the same time to kill all the species in the oceans. Okay. So bad for the species that were there, and it took them a long time to come back up after that big mass extinction event in terms of diversity, but they did. And that's adaptive radiation. When one species that is the founder, the one species that's left after extinction, gives rise to many afterwards in order to fill the open ecological niches. That genetic diversity that's inherent in a population in the right conditions can be enough to actually lead to new speciation events. Rather than getting into all this thing about clients and ecotypes, you don't want to talk about lipids. I would rather talk about. Okay. We have talked about ways in which environments and organisms interact with each other in order to cause evolution over time frames. But humans can cause evolution too. We can do it accidentally when we cause genetic drift or we cut off gene flow. We can do it on purpose when we select organisms with specific traits in order to be the parents of the next generation. And so we have artificially selected for things like all our modern agricultural crops and a whole bunch of different other types of organisms that we find useful to us, okay? Native wild corn in North America make little tiny corn kernels that don't taste good, okay? We have selected for corn producing plants that make bigger and more bountiful ears of corn, and that makes sweeter and more nutritiously advantageous corn kernels to us. And then we select for those corn plants and preferentially breed them to make more corn plants like them. Okay, that's artificial selection, where we use selective processes to gain traits that are beneficial to humans. We can do it by working within the DNA of a species in artificial selection, or we now have our technology where we can genetically modify organisms. We can take genes out of one species and paste them into other species so that we can get dogs that have crazy hair colors and types that they would never normally get from just normal breeding processes. Okay. We can get strawberries that are frost resistant because we've spliced in a gene from bacteria that helps them overcome ice crystal formation. Okay, it's pretty cool. We can make crops that are resistant to the pesticides and herbicides that we spray on them. Okay, like there are big advantages to this. There are downsides to genetic modification too. What I want you to consider with your partner, and I will let you choose. I'd like to have groups of 3 today, just so like maybe you talk to somebody that you don't always talk to. I want you to consider Captain America as a genetically modified organism. Okay. And so Captain America, remember, was this normal scrawny looking guy, and he went to like join